Hi, good morning and good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all and thank you everyone for participating in this CISMOR seminar. I am Anri Ishiguro and will be the moderator of today's seminar. I'm an assistant professor of the International Institute of American Studies, and I am also a research fellow of CISMOR at Deut University. The seminar today is organized by CISMOR and co-organized JSPS grant in aid for scientific research. The title is Criticism and Acceptance, Historical Developments in Zionist Thought Among 20th Century American Jewish Scholars and Rabbis. And also it's collaborated with the CISMOR Research Fellow workshop. It's called in Japanese,シオン・エルサレム聖地館の再建と聖書テキストから今日に至るまで。So today we are honored to welcome Dr. Hanan Mazeh, the Berkowitz Research Fellow, New York University School of Law. To greet Dr. Mazeh, I'd like to ask Professor Ada Cohen, Professor of Graduate School of Theology and the Director of CISMOR. Professor Dr. Cohen, please.
Thank you, and thank you all for joining us this early morning in Japan for the 5th seminar of CISMOR for this year. I firstly thank Dr. Anri Ishiguro for initiating the invitation to our guest speaker in the framework of the research conducted under the unit of Jewish Studies at CISMOR Center. And secondly, I thank Dr. Hanan Mazeh of the New York University School of Law for accepting our invitation to lecture at a late hour in New York. Dr. Mazeh will lead us today through the world of rabbinic literature, and I'm sure we all will find it very interesting. So, Dr. Ishiguro, I return the video to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Cohen. So let me introduce our guest speaker. So Dr. Hanan Mazeh is a scholar of late antique rabbinic literature. His research and published articles explore textual and semantic developments in this corpus as a key to understanding the rabbinic society in the 1st century CE within its cultural context. His particular focus is the Palestinian Talmud and its unique texture, and he is interested in questions of territory and relations between Jew and Gentile in Roman Palestinian, as well as organization of halachic knowledge. Dr. Mazeh completed his PhD in Jewish history at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev, where he has written his dissertation, Tractate Dimai of the Palestinian Talmud, Halakha, Interpretation and Social Dynamics during the Aramaic period. He is an RD of both the Rothschild and Fulbright postdoc program fellowship, and during 2021 and 2 was a Lutz Martha Fellow at the Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies, University of Pennsylvania. He has also previously been a Reitman Fellow at the Ben-Gurion University and a research fellow at the Cornell Einstein Center in Berlin and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So finally, please welcome Dr. Hanan Mazeh. The titles and the Lord your God will bring you into the land that your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it. Deuteronomy 35, the land of Israel in rabbinic literature. So please welcome Dr. Hanan Mazeh.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ishiguro, for your kind introduction, and also for initiating the invitation and inviting me for this lecture at the CISMOR Center at University. I'm very pleased to join you from the other side of the globe as technology allows us, and to present in front of this interdisciplinary forum some of my work. And I'm sure that your diverse perspectives can be very valuable for my research. And I'm looking forward very much to our discussion after the lecture. So let me first share my screen. Is it working well? Do you see it? I hope so.
Yes, we can see.
Good, thank you. So I would like to share with you today some of my ongoing research about the concept of the land of Israel and the construction of the Jewish territory in classical rabbinic literature. That is, the collection of Jewish texts that was compiled in the first century CE, mostly, and in the part I'm interested in particular, in Roman Palestine. Let me open with an introduction to this topic before diving into the details. I apologize if some of it might be known to some of you, but I think it is important in order to give some context to our discussion today. The Jewish rabbinic group, at the historic point that we are talking about, had been a conquered community under Roman rule for quite some time. First, as a protectorate, after Pompeius Magnus took over the East in 63 BC, and later as a formal Roman province, named originally Judea and afterwards Syria-Palestina. It has gone through two large-scale, catastrophe-resulting revolts against the Romans. The first one around 70 CE, which led to the destruction of the temple and the religious center in Jerusalem. And the second in the 130s CE, which resulted in a devastation of the Jewish settlement in Judea and the shift of the Jewish center northward to the Galilee. In the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, the time when the texts I'm interested in are being composed, we are talking about a community that is fragmented to a considerable extent, living in urban and rural regions in the Galilee, alongside many non-Jews. Hard to estimate how many non-Jews, but apparently in growing numbers, especially dominant in urban spaces, as the region in general is being absorbed into the wide Roman East and subordinated in many ways to the regional center in Provincia Syria. Evidently, the concept of territory that we are dealing with in this context, where this community seemed to have had very little real control over the region, politically, economically, administratively, and so on, is not a regular sense of territory and is much harder to articulate. It is a halachic territory, a space which is subject to regulation in an array of topics in Jewish religious law, mostly agriculture related, the so-called mitzvot hatluyot ba'aretz, commandments that are dependent on the land, due to the land holiness. For instance, the prohibition to cultivate the land during the 7th year, the sabbatical year, Shnat HaShemitah, only applies to soil within what is considered the land of Israel. Similarly, one is principally obligated to give a priest a portion of dough out of every substantial bread that he makes, only if the dough is made from grain that was grown inside the land. I would like to illustrate this point, the notion of halachic territory and the way it functions in Roman Palestine, by looking at two sources. The first is a passage that is brought in the Tosefta, that is a rabbinic collection, probably from the 3rd century CE. Do you see the text? I hope so.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. One who walks from Aker to Kziv, Ekdipa, on his right, east of the road, it is pure in terms of the impurity of Gentile land and obligated in Tais and sabbatical year, unless known to be exempt. On his left, west of the road, it is impure in terms of Gentile land and exempt from Tais and sabbatical year, unless known to be obligated. This source instructs a person walking northwards on the ancient Roman coastal road, which is the main route of transportation in the region at the time, towards Syria. Here is a map that you can see the coastal road going all the way from Alexandria in Egypt, all the way up to Antioch, the capital of Provincia, Syria. And here is a focus on the Galilee. And you can see here the coastal road going up from Palestine up to Tyre. Here is Ptolemais, which is Akko that we are talking about. And the person that we are talking about is walking on this road from here, from Akko, Ptolemais, up here to Kziv. This point here is Kziv that we will talk about soon again. So he's instructed the person that his right side, inland, is considered the land of Israel for halachic purposes, whereas the part on his left, closer to the coast, isn't. Thus, this part of the Roman road, on which most bypassers would walk seamlessly, is in fact a borderline for the observant rabbinic Jew. The second source is one of the most significant epigraphic findings in connection to rabbinic literature, perhaps the most famous one, namely the Rehov inscription, a mosaic found on the floor of a synagogue a few kilometers from the city of Bet She'an, Skytopolis. Here on the map is Skytopolis, Bet She'an, and the mosaic was found a little bit to the south over here, probably from the 6th or 7th century CE. The people who built this synagogue, interestingly, chose to decorate the floor with an elaborate halachic text, most of which is taken from rabbinic literature about the borders of the land of Israel. Let us take a quick look at two parts of this inscription. One part is a relatively detailed description of the borders of the land of Israel. And it translated to English, it reads, the borders of Eretz Israel, the place which they who returned from Babylon held, the Ashkelon junction and the wall of Strela's tower, Dor and the wall of Akko and the head of the waters of Gaaton, and Gaaton itself, and Karbatha and Betzenita, and the castrum of Galila and Kubaya or peaks of Aita, and Mamtzia of Jurkata, and the fourth of Kuraim, and the neighborhood of Yatir, and the brook of Betzael, and so on and so on. And upper Talmegola of Caesarea, that is Panias. All up to this point is the northern border. In Besabal and Kanata and Rekem, Tagnotis, that's the east. Zimra, Vetlemitz, Batsra, Liabok, and Cheshbon, in the book of Zered, Igar, Sahaduta, Nimrin, in Fort of Raziza, Rekem of Gaia, and the gardens of Ashkelon, and the great road leading to the desert. This outstanding list delineates the land of Israel as a whole, focusing particularly on the northern border. Much scholarship has been devoted to the list and to the identification of the sites in it. On a map, it would look more or less like this. In any case, the purpose of this source is to form a clear, continuous line which is marked by concrete, presumably known, topographic points that would provide a two-dimensional territory for halachic purposes. Another part of the inscription gives a more focused account, zooming in on the city of Bet She'an. This part reads, These are the places which are permitted around Bet Shean. On the south, which is the campus gate, till the white field. On the west, which is the gate of the oil press, till the end of the pavement. On the north, which is the gate of the watchtower, till Kfar Kalnos, and Kfar Kalnos is as Bet Shean. And on the east, which is the dung gate, till the tomb of Panoktaya. And the gate of Kfar Zimrin and the gate of the uncleared field, before the gate it is allowed and beyond it is forbidden. This part draws the area around the city of Bet Shean. Here, around the city of Bet Shean, which is not considered part of the land of Israel, despite being inside the boundaries mentioned above. Again, the demarcation relies on distinct sites around the city, as for instance, the White Field or the tomb of Panoptia, which seem to have been known to local Jews, presumably to the typical Jew who would have come to the synagogue where the mosaic was installed, for which Bet Shean was the big neighboring city. These texts demonstrate how concerned was the rabbinic community in Palestine with marking its space, both the land in whole and on a more local level, and in forming this designated halachic sphere within spaces in Roman province, on roads, in cities, as well as in the rural backland, where a different set of regulations apply. The question that interests me, in which I would like to discuss with you today, is what are the theoretical models and spatial assumptions that lie beneath the rabbinic construction of this halachic territory? I should mention that the white subject of the land of Israel in rabbinic literature has drawn considerable scholarly attention, including several monographs. One recent recommended example is Eyal Ben Eliyahu's book that is here on the screen, Eyal Ben Eliyahu, Identity and Territory, Jewish Perceptions of Space and Antiquity. However, generally speaking, this scholarship, and in many other topics in rabbinic literature, has tended to address this corpus as a whole, sometimes overlooking meaningful differences and nuances within it. The challenge with the eclectic nature of rabbinic literature, but also one of the great potentials in its study, is that it consists of numerous sources that were gathered together over many decades, and those often speak in different voices. Reading them closely may often reveal diverse, sometimes competing approaches, and also show developments over time. Highlighting the differences, rather than trying to harmonize them, gives us a much fuller image of rabbinic lines of thought and concerns with regard to the issue at hand. Along these lines, today I wish to examine several texts relatively closely, focusing on 2 points in the rabbinic construction of the land of Israel and its territory. The first point is gradual territorial models, that is, different non-binary or non-dichotomic territorial distinctions, specifically around the question whether the land of Syria is part of the land of Israel or not. The second point is the notion of ethnic occupation of the land as a criterion to define its status as part of the land of Israel, and the development of this criterion over time. The texts deal with some complicated issues of agricultural law, which are sometimes difficult even to specialists in rabbinic literature. In any event, our discussion will avoid some of the halachic details and will focus on the general territorial structures that these sources display. So first, let's talk about gradual models of territory. The territorial halachic status of Syria in rabbinic texts is particularly interesting. As we have seen, the border of the land, according to the Rehov inscription, which also appears in other rabbinic parallels, is drawn in the northern part of the Galilee, around that red line over here. This pretty much corresponds with another source in the Tosefta, which reads, "In which is the land of Israel, from the river south of Gziv and beyond." This line is somewhat peculiar, a little out of context, and its halachic concern is unclear. It defines the point of entrance to the land of Israel when coming from the north on the coastal Roman road, and sets the border at the river south of Gziv, probably the Ga'aton River, which was mentioned in the inscription. The city of Gziv, which is mentioned as a border point in other sources, as we have seen, is the last village on the coastal road when heading north, before the steep slope called the Ladder of Tyre. Let's look again at the map. Here, at this point over here, the last point is Gziv, right before this mountain, which is the Ladder of Tyre, which is a substantial geographical landmark. Here is how this landmark looks from the south, from Gziv upwards. And this marks the border between Israel and Lebanon in our days as well. It is also assumed that the administrative border between Syria and Palestine under Roman rule, which we do not know to mark precisely, was somewhere around this border. In any case, our source does not specify what exactly is the status of the territory before arriving at Gziv. One may assume that Syria, for that matter, is considered chutz la'aretz, outside the land. In contrast, elsewhere in the Tosefta, it is stated, which is the land and which is outside the land. All that slopes down from Taurus Amanus and beyond is the land of Israel, from Taurus Amanus and outward, outside the land. This source, similarly to the previous one, is a general statement that does not seem to relate to any specific halachic issue. It is a little more explicit in that it defines both sides of the border, the land of Israel on the one side, and chutz la'aretz, outside the land, on the other side. However, the border point here, the Taurus Amanus mountain range, in our day southern Turkey, is very far from Gziv. Here it is on the map. These mountains, also a significant landmark, were a well-known border point in antiquity and were considered to be the gate to Asia, as well as the border between the two Roman provinces, Syria and Cilicia. In other words, this source, despite resembling the previous one in looking northward on the coastal high road, stretches the realm of the land of Israel much further, to the northern border of Provincia Syria. In that sense, one may see here a remarkably different image of Jewish halachic territory, and its part in Syrian space, perhaps a territorial fantasy that includes the entire geopolitical region. What should we make of these two very different border points? Is Syria then part of the land of Israel, or isn't it? As we will now see, sources present complex answers to that question. Let us take a look at one of the central sources in that regard, in Tractate Shvi'it 6.1 of the Mishnah, which is the most authoritative rabbinical legal code redacted in the early 3rd century CE. It deals with the prohibition on cultivating the land of Israel during the sabbatical year. There are 3 territories with regard to the sabbatical year. All that was held by those who came up from Babylon, from the land of Israel and until Gziv, may not be eaten nor be cultivated. And all that was held by those who come up from Egypt, from Gziv until the river and until Amanam, and in other versions of the Mishnah, it's Amanos, the Amanus range, may be eaten, but may not be cultivated. From the river and from Amanam and forward may be eaten and cultivated. This is a particularly interesting source that deserves close examination. First, let us note that it does not define the land of Israel per se, but rather designates territories with regard to the prohibitions of sabbatical year. It presents a gradual tripartite model based on two parameters into which we will not get in here: the prohibition to cultivate the land, nevad, and the prohibition to eat the produce, nechal. The first territory is prohibited in both aspects, may not be eaten nor be cultivated. The second territory, the intermediate zone, is prohibited in cultivation, but is permitted in eating. The third territory is completely permitted, may be eaten and cultivated. The landmarks that demarcate these territories are three: Ziv and Amanos, that we have previously discussed, complemented by the river, Hanahar, probably the Euphrates, the eastern border of Provincia Syria. The first territory stretches from the land of Israel and until Ziv. The second is demarcated between Ziv and Amanos to the north, and up to the Euphrates in the northeast. And the third territory is further on, outside the lines of the Euphrates in the Amanos range. Thus, this source presents a gradual image. While Palestina is fully considered the land of Israel with regard to Shvit prohibitions, Syria is considered to be of partial value. We also may wonder what's the relationship between the gradual model in this source and the two borderlines that we have seen separately in the Tosefta. In other words, should we assume that this model is in fact a combination, a compromise between two existing sets of boundaries? Perhaps the other way around? I don't think there is a clear-cut answer in this case. But be that as it may, looking closer at this source shows that there is more to it than that. Aside from the geographical demarcation, the Mishnah also defines the first territory as all that was held by those who came up from Babylon, and the second territory as all that was held by those who came up from Egypt. This unusual terminology seems to provide an historiographical background to the geographical division that it accompanies. The inner territory, until Ziv, is explained to be the line to which the Jewish population has reached since the return to Zion from Babylon, an era that carries on until the times of the rabbis themselves. The intermediate zone is explained to be the territory that was held by those who came up from Egypt, that is, the maximum reach of the biblical kingdom, perhaps in King David's days. However, there are some significant difficulties with the formulation of this Mishnah and what we may call a textual tension between its components. First, the expansion of the kingdom, according to the biblical text, does not exactly fit the specification in the Mishnah until the river and until Amanos. On the other side, the Jewish settlement in the days of the rabbis, all that was held by those who came up from Babylon, is supposed to be ostensibly still open to changes during their time, and in that sense should not be bound to Ksiv specifically. And finally, on a textual level, we can see that when the Mishnah gets to the final part, from the river and from Amanam and forward, the historiographical terminology is abandoned, and we are left only with a topographical one. That is to say, that the conjunction between the components in the definition of three territories, the geographical, administrative one, and the demographic, historiographical one, is not smooth, and we should suspect that this source is a product of textual compound. This reconstruction is further strengthened when we're looking at two parallel sources to this Mishnah. The first parallel is in Mishnah Chala 4.8 that deals with setting aside a portion of dough for the priest, which is, as I mentioned, fully applicable only in the land of Israel. We shall read it without getting into all the complicated halachic details. Rabban Gamliel says, there are three territories with regard to challah, bread. From the land of Israel and until Kziv, one challah. From Kziv and until the river and until Hanan, two challah. One for the fire, one for the priest, and the one for the fire has a measure. From the river and from Amana and forward, two challahs, one for the fire and one for the priest, and the one for the fire does not have a measure. We can see that this Mishnah refers to the same three territories designated by the same landmarks, Ziv, the river, and Amanus. Clearly, there is a close connection between these two regulations, the one regarding sabbatical year and the one regarding the dough. However, the demographic historiographical terminology and the reference to the comers from Babylon or Egypt is completely absent in this Mishnah. In other words, quite plausibly, this indicates that the component was not part of the original model. The second parallel is found in Sifrei Deuteronomy, a 3rd century Tannaitic Midrash, contemporaneous more or less to the Mishnah. This text cites a halacha which is very similar to our Mishnah in Shvi'it. Thus you say, any place that was held by those who came up from Babylon, from the land of Israel and until Kziv, may not be eaten, nor be cultivated. Those who came up from Egypt may be eaten, but may not be cultivated. Neither these nor these may be eaten and cultivated. The resemblance between this source and the Mishnah that we saw is apparent, based on the same division to three territories in terms of two parameters, eating the fruit and cultivating the land. Clearly, this is a version of the same regulation. However, the division in this version is based on the demographic historiographical terminology, and only at one point do we find the mention of a geographic criterion from the land of Israel and until Kziv. This source thus represents, I argue, a mirroring perspective to the previous one, based on what is held rather than concrete geographical landmarks. And we find a textual addition in the opposite direction. The model in this version is a more dynamic one. Indeed, its title does not refer to three lands with regard to the sabbatical year. The boundaries are not bound to Kziv, and further areas, if they are held by Israel, may turn to be a part of the land of Israel. We shall return to this point shortly. We can thus reconstruct, as this analysis shows, two distinct models with regard to the definition of the boundaries in connection to sabbatical prohibitions, and particularly to the territory of Syria. The first model, which had been the basis of Mishnah Shvi'it, and appears also in Mishnah Chala, divides the region based on clear and well-known landmarks, Ziv, the river, and Amanus. In accordance with the estimated boundaries of provinces Syria and Palestine. The second model, a more dynamic one, is based on occupation of the land and does not draw clear boundaries. In addition, we are able to trace a textual process of reciprocal influence between these two models, which is manifest in the formulation of the sources that are in front of us. A line from the Mishnah model had been added to the Sifrei, and 2 lines from the Sifrei's model were added to the Mishnah. In a different direction, other sources bring forward other models of graduality to define the intermediate status of Syria. For instance, the very next passage in Mishnah Shvi'it, immediately following the one that discussed above, states, in Syria, one may work with detached produce, but not with attached. They may thresh, winnow, tread, or collect into sheaves, but they may not harvest, nor cut the grapes, nor harvest the olives. Rabbi Akiva said a principle. all that its kind is permitted in the land of Israel may be done in Syria. This source refers to simply Syria, presumably the Roman province, and meaning the demarcated territory between Ziv, Amanos, and the river. The name Syria may reflect a more standardized attitude to the territory, or, as Ben Eliyahu points out, a deeper engagement with the Roman view of the region. In any case, the discussion here deals with different types of tasks in the agricultural process, ones that are done when the crop is still physically attached to the land, and others that are done after harvest. In contrast to the land of Israel, where both kinds are presumably prohibited, in Syria, those that are not directly connected to the land are permitted. We thus find here, in the very subsequent passage in the Mishnah, a separate attempt to define Syria's status with regard to sabbatical prohibitions, distinguishing here not between eating and cultivating, but between different types of work, and thus differentiate between Syria and the land of Israel. A different attempt could be found in Tosefta Kelim A15, which reads, in 3 ways is Syria equal to the land of Israel, and in 3 outside the land. Its dirt impurifies as outside the land. And he who brings the writ of divorce from Syria is like one who brings from outside the land. And he who sells his slave to Syria is like one who sells to outside the land. 3, to the land of Israel, for he who purchases a field in Syria is like one who purchases in the suburbs of Jerusalem, and it is obligated in tithes and in shvi'it, and if one enter it in purity, it is pure. This list is a collection of diverse halachic aspects regarding Syria that appear elsewhere in rabbinic literature in some form. Its compilation, which deserves a discussion in its own right, reflects an attempt to consolidate the various halachic principles that apply to Syria to a somewhat coherent system as an intermediate territory. However, in this case, its intermediacy is reflected not by a different level of obligation, as in the previous source, but rather in that this territory, being considered the land of Israel in some issues, but as outside the land in others. To conclude this first point, these sources present different gradual models to define the halachic status of Syria and its relation to the territory of the land of Israel. As we have seen, these models vary both in terminology and in the kind of separations they should suggest. The texts also reveal processes of systemization and textual influence between sources along the way. However, the comparison between the different models also emphasizes their common ground, that is, a diversified conceptual effort to define this territory in intermediate terms that seems to express an outspread ambivalence among the rabbis towards it. There are 2 points in this regard which I find particularly noteworthy. First, I think that this kind of non-binary notions, which is certainly present in rabbinic thought about other legal constructs, is not trivial when talking about territory. I'm not an expert in law, but I wonder if we would have been able to imagine a region which is non-binary in a territorial sense, a place which is both a part and a non-part of a sovereign state, or it is a part in some respects, but is not considered a part in other respects, or that the law applies in it only to a lower degree. In the rabbinic perspective, however, since we are dealing with a strictly halachic space in the legal realm, it then becomes more natural to conceptualize it with typical halachic way of thought of categories and subcategories as we see. The second point I want to stress out has to do with the historical political context. One may see the effort to define the halachic status of Syria, part of the land of Israel or not, as an attempt among the rabbis to establish their complex Jewish identity and distinctiveness within the Roman East. In this context, this case presents an interesting interplay in terms of core and periphery. Syria, as richly described in the work of Maurice Sartre, for instance, was a center of gravity of the Roman East in military, political, and administrative terms. Palestine, in particular, throughout the centuries and several administrative reforms along the years, had been subordinated to it in many ways. In contrast, from the Jewish halachic perspective, the distinct territorial center to which Syria is adjunct is the land of Israel. And now to my second point, ethnic occupation. The second conceptual aspect I wish to focus on in the remaining time is the notion of Jewish occupation as a criterion in defining the status of the land and how this idea develops within rabbinic literature. As we have seen, certain texts define the land of Israel as what was held by the Jewish population in the era since the return from Babylon. This holding of the land could mean perhaps Jewish conquer or demographic control over an entire region, a city, or a village. However, a much more intriguing understanding that comes up in several sources deals with private ownership of lands. I would like to examine this concept as it appears in a few texts. Here again, we find a few variations, and think a little bit about what it means in terms of constructing Jewish territory. Let us return to Syria for a moment and its unique status. A few sources deal mainly with tithe obligations are based on the notion that the status of the land of Syria is dependent upon the ethnos of its owner. Land that belongs to an Israelite is considered, in terms of tithe obligations, as being part of the land of Israel, and whereas land that belongs to Gentile is considered chutz la'aretz, outside the land. Here is one source that illustrates this concept. An Israelite and a Gentile who purchase together a field in Syria, they are considered as untithed and tithed produce which are mixed together, the words of Rabbi. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, the Israelites' portion is obligated, the Gentiles' portion is exempted. I'll explain this source. The two rabbis discuss a case of partnership where an Israelite and a Gentile own a field in Syria together. And the rabbis debate whether the produce should be obligated in tithes or not. We should note, they disagree about the adequate solution in the unique case such a partnership presents. But the underlying assumption, questioned by neither of them, is that in principle, a land of an Israelite in Syria would be obligated and that of a Gentile would be exempt. Syria, again, is constructed as an intermediate territory, but we should dwell on the idea for a moment. The graduality goes as follows. The land of Israel is fully obligated in tithe. The territory of chutz la'aretz, outside the land, is exempt. The status of Syria is not based on partial obligation of some sort, as we have seen. Rather, its intermediacy takes effect only in that it is able to be considered either here, if it belongs to an Israelite, or there, if it belongs to a Gentile. In other words, there are only two halachic options here. And the conceptual division between the territories is essentially binary between the land of Israel and what is outside of it. Within this dichotomy, lands in Syria could dynamically be considered on either side as if having an on-off button in the Jewishness of its owner. Other sources take this concept forward in interesting directions. Here, for instance, is the next passage in the Tosefta. An Israelite who purchased a field in Syria, even if he subsequently sold it to a Gentile, it remains obligated in Tais and Shivit, since it has been already obligated. This passage proclaims that the status of the land of Syria as a Jewish one, after it was bought by an Israelite, is irreversible. In other words, there is only an on button, no off button. In this light, the issue of Jewish ownership in Syria is understood to be not a mere technical criterion in the context of tithe, but as part of an expansion process of the land of Israel, and as one of the versions of what was held by those who came from Babylon. And now we see how dynamic this criterion can be. According to this model, Provincius Syria in its entirety, which stretches all the way out to the Euphrates and the northern Amanus range, carries the potential of being part of the land of Israel. And this potential is activated when it is first bought into Jewish possession. But in contrast to the boundaries in earlier times, which have been determined by conquest or political control, the sanctity of the land now expands by private ownership of land. The holding of the land, as a halachic criterion, according to this model, is privatized. And the boundaries of the land of Israel may now expand whenever a real estate deal contract is signed. This transition is best articulated in a passage from the Palestinian Talmud, the Yerushalmi, a text that from the 3rd or 4th century that interprets the Mishnah. The passage is brought in the context of the Mishnah in Shvi'it, discussed above, that refers to what was held by those who came from Babylon and those who came from Egypt. The Talmud distinguishes between these two eras and highlights the difference between them in terms of occupying the land. That is what is written, and the Lord your God will bring you into the land that your fathers possessed, that you may possess it. Your possession has been compared to the possession of your fathers, and he will make you transcend and surpass your fathers. Your fathers had been exempted and became obligated. Also you have been exempted and became obligated. Your fathers did not carry the burden of an empire, but you, despite carrying the burden of the empire. Your fathers became obligated only after acquiring it all, but you, each first one acquires and becomes obligated. This passage, which I really love, interprets a verse from Deuteronomy 35 that describes Israel's return to their land from exile. And I mark it here in the verse from Deuteronomy in orange. And the Lord your God will bring you into the land that your fathers possessed, that you may possess it. And he will make you transcend and surpass your fathers. From the rabbi's perspective, this prophecy is understood to be speaking of their own days, the era that started with the return from the exile in Babylon. In this context, the biblical promise that the possession of the land will surpass that of their fathers who came from Egypt seems unreal. Clearly, the Jewish control in their days under Rome was much narrower in terms of territory and far as could be from the military and political dominance of the region in the days of King David. Here lies the innovation of this midrash, which has to do with the concept of private ownership, and it turns the biblical promise on its head. The possession of the land in rabbinic times is superior precisely in that it takes effect even without control. The fathers acquired land through conquest and sovereignty, whereas we, under Rome, acquire it through buying parts of it individually. This is a dramatic conceptual shift in the perception of Jewish occupation of the land and of the territory's Jewishness, which reflects, to a large extent, the rabbi's self-definition as a conquered community. Before concluding, there is one more point with regard to the private ownership criterion, the last chapter of the narrative, which I would like to shortly lay out. If we look closely at the last few texts, we may discern an important difference. The sources from the Tosefta, which is an earlier text from the 3rd century, talk about the criterion of Jewish private ownership only in the context of Syria. Syria's intermediate status is defined by that lands which belong to Israelites there are obligated in tithes, and if they were part of the land of Israel. However, the last passage from the Palestinian Talmud, which is a slightly later text, depicts this concept as an essential characteristic of Israel's occupation of the land of Israel, and as part of a larger historiographical narrative. According to this passage, and as indicated in other sources in the Yerushalmi as well, this concept would apply to the land of Israel in its entirety, not only lands in Syria. In other words, the basic status of the land of Israel has been perceived, according to the later version, as fundamentally deriving from it being in Jewish private hands. Moreover, in the Palestinian Talmud, a new halachic opinion arises, according to which Gentile fields inside the land of Israel itself are exempted from tithes. This is how it is formulated in the words of the Palestinian Talmud, here in orange, that a Gentile does have acquisition in the land of Israel to exempt it from tithes. This opinion is brought up in several discussions in the Yerushalmi, although it is under dispute. That unique view seems to present a mirroring concept to the private ownership criterion in Syria. Just as fields that belong to Israelites in Syria are obligated in tithes, so are fields that belong to Gentiles in the land of Israel exempted. Thus, we may perhaps speak of a conceptual evolution with regard to this idea. At first, in the sources in the Tosefta, private ownership has been used to signify Syria's intermediate status. At a later stage, in the Palestinian Talmud, this tool had been turned inside and became a criterion to determine the status of lands in the land of Israel itself. According to the model in the later version, the whole region, lands around Antioch, as those around Sepphoris at the heart of the Galilee, are all defined by a single symmetric principle. Such a line of thought has profound implications on how the territory is perceived. We may say that this version brings to an end the process of privatization of the ethnic occupation as a defining criterion for the land's boundaries and its sanctity. A land defined this way would not necessarily compose a continuous territory. One field owned by a Jew would be considered part of the territory, and a neighboring field that belongs to a non-Jew would be considered outside the land. In other words, the land of Israel could become the collection of land belonging to some Israelites, rather than a single territory belonging to the entire people known collectively as Israel. To conclude, in this lecture, I focused on two interrelated issues with regard to how the land of Israel is perceived in rabbinic literature, which is, as I emphasized, a diversified collection of sources, and how it is constructed as a halachic territory for observant Jews in modern Palestine. First, I examined different gradual non-binary models of territory around the question whether the land of Syria is part of the land of Israel. As I have shown, sources present a variety of theoretical models to define Syria's intermediate status in terms of halachic obligations, such as being applicable to only a lower degree of obligation, only certain obligations, or only when it belongs to Jews. I suggested to see this general tendency as reflecting the rabbi's ambivalent attitude toward Syria, the dominant neighboring province in the north. The second topic I focused on is the notion of ethnic occupation of the land as a criterion to define its status as part of the land of Israel. A careful examination of the corpus shows that this criterion is used in different ways and seems to have developed over time. In the Tosefta, it is used to define Syria's intermediate status. That is, that fields that belong to Jews in Syria are considered to be part of the land of Israel. In a later version, so it seems, this principle had been amplified and had become an essential component in defining the status of the land of Israel in its entirety, and in the rabbi's most basic understanding of Jewish territoriality in their days under Rome. This nuance may present a whole different view of the land of Israel as a non-continuous space. Its development may be reflective of how Palestina was gradually integrated, from the Rabbinic perspective, into the unified Syrian region, and of the fading memory of Jewish sovereignty and its boundaries. These two unusual concepts in relation to the territory, a partial land of Israel on the one hand, and a fragmented land of Israel on the other hand, should be seen, I think, in the context of the land being a halachic theoretical construct, rather than an actual controlled space. In any case, the conceptual turbulence that we find in rabbinic literature with regard to the most essential definitions of the concept of the land of Israel and the spatial assumptions that underlie it are an important key to grasp not only the rabbi's perception of their space within Roman Palestine, but also, to a certain extent, this community's struggle to form its identity. Thank you. I'm looking forward to our discussion.